Uncle Damien, can you hear me? The 3-year-old girl called out in a trembling voice, her eyes wide as she saw the most feared man in the underworld tied tightly to a wooden chair in the middle of a dark cellar. His shirt was soaked through with blood. A shattered pocket watch lay right beneath his feet, and his hands could barely move. While the entire Cross organization believed their boss had vanished, and dozens of men were desperately searching every corner of the city for him, not one soul knew that the first person to find Damien was a 3-year-old daughter of a poor housekeeper. The moment Sophie burst into tears and threw herself against his knees, she had unknowingly shattered the perfect scheme of a traitor hiding within the family itself. But the little girl had no idea that from that very second, she and her mother had become his enemy's next two targets. 24 hours before Sophie would find him bleeding in a cellar beneath his own house, Damian Cross stood at the tall arched window of his second-floor study, watching the last hour of an October afternoon collapse across the lawn. Ravenwood Estate ran on a rhythm so precise that most of the staff could set their watches by it. Breakfast at 7. The morning briefing at 8. His driver waiting at the front steps by 8:30, engine already warm. It was a rhythm Damian had built deliberately in the years since the fire that took his parents, because precision was the only thing that had ever made him feel like the ground beneath him would hold. Maya Torres had worked as a housekeeper at Ravenwood for 6 months, hired through an agency after the previous housekeeper's abrupt retirement. She was 27, quiet in the particular way of someone who had learned that quiet kept a job secure. And she brought her daughter to work exactly once a week, on Sundays, when the estate's skeleton staff made it easier to keep a toddler out of sight in the small laundry room off the kitchen. Her daughter, Sophie, was 3 years old, fearless in the specific way small children are before the world teaches them caution, and utterly incapable of staying anywhere she'd been told to stay. Damian had noticed Maya only twice in 6 months. Once in passing, when she'd apologized for a vase knocked over while dusting, her voice tight with the particular fear of someone who couldn't afford to lose this job. And once from this very window, watching her walk the long driveway toward the bus stop after a double shift, alone, exhausted, refusing the car service he'd instructed his staff to offer to anyone working past dark. He had thought, both times, that there was something in her he recognized, some careful, guarded competence that came from surviving things she never spoke about, and had done nothing about the thought at all. Because Damian Cross did not have room in his life for noticing people. That changed the following evening. He had left for a routine meeting at a warehouse near the Brooklyn waterfront, a meeting with Enzo Ricci, a supplier he had worked with for 11 years, over a shipment discrepancy that should have taken 20 minutes to resolve. It took considerably longer, because Enzo Ricci had, in the last 6 months, quietly sold his loyalty to Salvatore Reyes, the one rival who had spent a decade trying to find a single moment of weakness in Damian's operation worth exploiting. Damian walked into that warehouse with 2 guards. He walked out with none, unconscious, a sedative working through his bloodstream faster than his body could fight it, and woke sometime later in a place his mind, still fogged and slow, needed several long minutes to identify. Not a warehouse. Not one of Reyes's known properties. The basement level of Ravenwood's own East Wing, the old wine cellar, unused for years. Accessible only through a service door most of the staff didn't know existed. His own house had become his prison, which meant whoever had done this had access no outsider should have had at all. His wrists were bound behind him with rope, cutting into skin already raw from struggling against it. A single bare bulb burned somewhere above him. His shirt clung to his side, soaked dark and warm where a blade had opened him during the struggle in Brooklyn. And somewhere beyond the heavy door, faint but growing louder, he could hear the unmistakable sound of small, careless footsteps, a child, humming tunelessly to herself, wandering somewhere she had absolutely no business being at all. Damian went rigid, every instinct in his body screaming at him to make a sound loud enough to warn the child away, and every ounce of his training screaming the opposite, silence, until he understood who else might be listening in that basement with him. He chose silence for exactly 4 more seconds. Then the humming stopped, and a small voice, hesitant now, called out from the other side of the door. "Hello? Is somebody there?" He recognized the voice before he fully processed why he recognized it. Sophie, Maya's daughter. The little girl he had passed twice in the hallway in 6 months and never once stopped to speak to properly. "Sophie," he said, keeping his voice as low and steady as he could manage, though the effort of it cost him more than he expected. Sophie, listen to me. I need you to go find your mother. Right now. Silence for a moment. Then the door handle rattled, and the heavy old door, never properly locked in years, because nobody had thought a forgotten wine cellar needed a working lock, creaked open under the determined push of a 3-year-old who had never once in her life obeyed an instruction to leave a mystery unsolved. She stood in the doorway in her socked feet, a stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, staring at him with an expression that shifted in the space of one heartbeat, from curiosity to raw, uncomprehending horror. Uncle Damian, she whispered. He had never told her to call him that. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words to this child in his life. But somewhere in the servants' quarters, apparently, he had already become Uncle Damian to a little girl who had decided, on her own, that the quiet, serious man who lived in the big house belonged to her the way adults sometimes simply do to children who have decided to love them. You're bleeding, Sophie said. And then she was crying, the sound of it high and frightened and entirely too loud for a basement that might, for all Damian knew, still hold whoever had put him here. Sophie, sweetheart, I need you to be very quiet, he said, as gently as his raw throat allowed. Can you do that for me? She nodded, tears streaming, and pressed both small hands over her own mouth to muffle the sobs, though her whole body still shook with them. Good girl, Damian said. Now I need you to untie this. He turned his bound wrist toward her as best he could, the rope biting deeper with the motion. Can you do that? Sophie's small fingers were clumsy with fear, and the knot had been tied by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. But she worked at it with the fierce, single-minded concentration only a frightened child fighting to help someone she loved could manage. Tugging and picking at the rope for what felt, to Damian, like the longest several minutes of his life. It was the sound of a second set of footsteps on the basement stairs that made them both freeze. Sophie? Sophie, baby, where? Maya Torres appeared in the doorway a heartbeat later, and stopped dead, her face draining of all color at the sight in front of her. Her daughter kneeling on the concrete floor beside a bound, bleeding man that half the city feared by name alone, working at his restraints with small, trembling hands. For one terrible, suspended second, Damian watched something move behind Maya's eyes that he recognized instantly, because he had felt the same calculation himself 1,000 times in rooms far more dangerous than this one. She was deciding whether to scream for whoever had done this and let them finish the job, whether to grab her daughter and run and pretend she had never seen any of this at all, whether helping the most feared man in New York was a debt she could survive incurring, or a death sentence dressed up as mercy. Maya, Damian said, his voice raw, but next 10 seconds, Damian said, I need you to know I will not hold it against you if you walk away. But if someone did this inside my own house, Maya, your daughter is already in more danger standing in this doorway than she would be helping me get out of it. Maya's eyes moved from his face to the rope, to the blood soaking through his shirt, to her daughter's small hands still working at the knot with fierce, stubborn determination. Something in her expression hardened, not fear anymore, but the particular, unyielding resolve of a mother who had just understood, in one terrible instant, that there was no version of walking away that actually kept her child safe. Move, she said to Sophie, crossing the room in 3 fast strides and dropping to her knees beside her daughter. Her fingers, steadier than her daughter's, found the knot and worked it loose in seconds, the rope falling away from Damian's raw wrists in a single motion. Thank you, Damian said, flexing his hands, wincing at the pain lancing up through his shoulders after hours bound in one position. Don't thank me yet, Maya said, already helping him lean forward, her eyes scanning the wound at his side with a quick, assessing focus that surprised him. That needs pressure now, or you're not walking out of this basement at all. She stripped off her cardigan without hesitation and pressed it hard against his side, and Damian, even through the pain, found himself studying her, the calm, practiced ways she'd assess the wound, the total absence of panic in her hands despite the fear still visible in her face. You've done this before, he said. My brother was in the army, Maya said, not looking up. I learned a few things visiting him in hospitals more times than I'd like to remember. She pressed harder, and Damian's breath hissed through his teeth. Who did this to you? I don't know yet, Damian admitted. But whoever it was had access to a part of this house almost nobody knows exists. Which means it's someone close to you, Maya finished quietly. Yes. Sophie, still kneeling beside them, had gone quiet now, watching her mother work with the same wide-eyed seriousness she'd shown untying the rope. her stuffed rabbit forgotten on the concrete floor beside her. "We need to get you upstairs," Maya said. "Somewhere with actual supplies and somewhere I can call for help." "No," Damian said sharply, and both Maya and Sophie flinched at the sudden hardness in his voice. He softened it immediately, aware of the fear his tone had put back into the child's face. "Not yet. Not until I know who did this. If I go upstairs and start giving orders, and the person responsible is still inside this house, they'll know immediately that I'm alive and free, and they'll move to finish what they started before I can identify them." "So what?" Maya said. "We just stay in a basement while you bleed?" "I need one phone call," Damian said. "To someone I trust completely. Not through the house line, not through my own phone. They took that when they took me." "Do you have a cell phone?" Maya hesitated only a moment before pulling a cracked, battered phone from her back pocket. The kind Damian recognized instantly as a phone kept working through sheer stubbornness rather than money to replace it, and handed it to him without another word. Damian dialed a number he had memorized 20 years ago and never once needed to write down. It rang twice. "Marcus," he said quietly, the moment the call connected. "It's me. I'm alive. I'm in the East Wing cellar, and I need you to come alone. And I need you to tell absolutely no one else in this house that you're coming." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Damian saw Maya's hand tighten protectively around her daughter's shoulder, before Marcus's voice came back, low and urgent. "Boss, thank God. I'll be there in 3 minutes." But Marcus's voice dropped lower, careful in a way that made the hair on the back of Damian's neck rise even before the words finished. "You need to know something before I get there. About who's been asking where you were all day." "Tell me now," Damian said, his grip tightening on Maya's battered phone. "Enzo Ricci called the house at 6 this morning," Marcus said, "before anyone even knew you were missing. Asked to speak to Walter directly, not to security, not to me. Said he needed to confirm the arrangement was still on schedule." A pause. "Boss, Walter's the only one besides me who knew about the cellar's old service entrance. His father helped build that wing 40 years ago." Damian closed his eyes. Walter Higgins had served this family for 22 years, had stood at his father's funeral, had been the one steady, familiar face in a house that had otherwise emptied out year after year. The idea that Walter had handed him over to Enzo Ricci, to Salvatore Reyes, to whoever was paying for this, felt for one disorienting moment more impossible than the rope still marking his wrists. "Get to the cellar," Damian said, quietly. "And Marcus, do not let Walter know I'm awake." "Not yet." "Understood." 3 minutes. Damian ended the call and handed the phone back to Maya, whose face had gone carefully blank in the particular way of someone bracing for news she suspected was worse than what she'd already witnessed. "Someone inside my own staff sold me out," he said. "Someone I trusted for 20 years. The butler," Maya said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Walter." Damian's eyes sharpened. "How do you know that name?" "Because 3 days ago," Maya said slowly, "I found him in the East Wing hallway near the old service door at 11 at night, when he had no reason to be anywhere near that part of the house. He told me he was checking for a draft." Her jaw tightened. I believed him. "I'm sorry. I should have said something." "You had no reason to suspect a man who's worked here longer than you've been alive," Damian said. "Neither did I, and I've known him since I was 19 years old." Sophie, still kneeling quietly beside her mother, tugged gently at Maya's sleeve. "Is Uncle Damian going to be okay?" "He's going to be just fine, baby," Maya said, though her eyes stayed fixed on Damian's face, searching it for the answer she wasn't fully sure of herself. Footsteps sounded on the basement stairs a moment later, controlled, familiar, and Damian's whole body eased fractionally at the sight of Marcus Reyes rounding the corner. Weapon already drawn, eyes scanning the room in one fast, practiced sweep before settling on Damian with open, visible relief. "Christ, boss." Marcus crossed the room in seconds, crouching to examine the wound Maya's cardigan was still pressed against. "We've had 40 men combing the city for you since noon. Nobody thought to check under our own roof." "That was the point," Damian said grimly. "Walter knew exactly how to make sure nobody looked here." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What do you want to do with him?" Damian looked past Marcus, at Maya still kneeling on the cold concrete with her arm around her daughter's shoulders, both of them having just witnessed enough in the last 20 minutes to make them permanent liabilities in the eyes of whoever had orchestrated this, Walter certainly, but possibly Enzo Ricci, Possibly Salvatore Reyes himself. Possibly a chain of dangerous men who would not forget the faces of the housekeeper and her daughter who had found him first. First, Damian said, I want them somewhere safe. Immediately. Before Walter or anyone else in this house realizes they're the two people who know I'm alive. Boss. Marcus. Damian's voice hardened. Maya and Sophie saw everything. If Walter finds out they found me before he could finish whatever he started, they become the loose end he can't afford to leave alive. I am not putting that on a woman who just saved my life with her bare hands. And I am certainly not putting it on a 3-year-old. Marcus looked between his boss and the housekeeper he'd apparently never spoken more than a few words to in 6 months. Something calculating and faintly surprised moving behind his eyes before he nodded once. I'll get them to the safe house on Willow Street, Marcus said. Nobody outside this room will know they're there. Maya's hand tightened around Sophie's shoulder. Wait, you want us to just leave? Go somewhere with strangers. Not strangers, Damian said, meeting her eyes with as much steadiness as his bleeding, exhausted body could manage. Marcus has been the one person in this world I've trusted completely for 15 years. He will keep you both safer than I can right now, bleeding on a cellar floor. He paused. Maya, I know I have no right to ask you to trust me with your daughter's safety. Not after tonight. But I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is a risk I refuse to let either of you carry. Maya looked down at Sophie, who was watching the exchange with wide, solemn eyes, one small hand still resting protectively on the sleeve of the man she decided, months ago and without anyone's permission, to call family. Okay, Maya said finally, quietly. I don't want to know everything, Damian. The moment it's safe to tell me. I didn't drag my daughter into a war without a reason. I deserve to know what it is. You will, Damian said. I promise you that. He did not yet know, as Marcus helped him to his feet and Maya gathered her frightened, exhausted daughter into her arms, that Walter Higgins was already standing at the top of the cellar stairs, having heard every word of the last 5 minutes through a door he had assumed. Wrongly, no one would think to check twice. Walter Higgins stood frozen at the top of the stairs for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to hear his own name. Long enough to understand that whatever he had built over the last 6 months had just collapsed in the space of a single conversation. Before he turned and walked away as calmly as 22 years of practiced composure allowed. He did not run. Running would draw attention. Instead, he walked the length of the East Wing corridor at his usual measured pace, retrieved his coat from the small closet near the servants' entrance, and let himself out through the side door into the cold October evening. Already dialing a number he had promised himself 3 days ago he would never need to use in a hurry. It's done, Walter said the moment the call connected. He's alive. He's found out about the cellar. You need to move now, before he moves against you. Salvatore Reyes' voice came back low and unhurried, entirely unbothered by news that should have alarmed him. Alive was always a possibility, Walter. I paid you to make sure I knew the moment it happened. You've done that. A pause. Who else knows? Walter hesitated, and in that hesitation, Salvatore's voice sharpened. Walter. Who else? A housekeeper, Walter admitted. And her daughter. They found him before Marcus Reyes did. They're being moved to a safe house tonight. Something in Salvatore's silence told Walter, even through the phone, that this detail had changed the calculation entirely. A woman and a child found him alive and untied him, Salvatore said slowly, which means they're the only 2 people who can testify that he was taken from inside his own house. By someone with intimate knowledge of it. That's not a loose end, Walter. That's the entire case against both of us, walking around with a pulse. They're just staff, Walter said, something uneasy moving into his voice for the first time. A housekeeper and a toddler. They don't know anything about business, about routes, about. They know Damian Cross was tied up and bleeding in his own cellar, Salvatore said. That's more than enough. Find out where this safe house is, Walter. Tonight. I already told you everything I know, Walter said, and something in his voice had begun to shake now. The calm composure of 22 years finally cracking under weight he hadn't fully understood he was carrying until this exact moment. I never agreed to anything happening to a child, Salvatore. That was never part of what we discussed. You agreed, Salvatore said, to help me remove a problem. You don't get to decide now which pieces of that problem are acceptable and which aren't. Walter stood alone in the dark driveway, his own breath fogging in the cold air, understanding with a slow, Sickening clarity that whatever debt or resentment had first pushed him towards Salvatore Reyes's offer 6 months ago, money perhaps, or some old grievance about being passed over, undervalued, forgotten in a house he had given his whole adult life to, had led him to a place he had never actually intended to go. Back inside the cellar, Damian sat gripping the edge of a makeshift bandage Marcus had applied with quick, practiced hands, watching Maya gather Sophie's stuffed rabbit off the concrete floor, tucking it carefully back into her daughter's arms. "The safe house has full security," Marcus was saying. "Two of my most trusted men on rotation. No one from the main house staff involved at all. Nobody will know they're there except you and me." "Good," Damian said. He looked at Maya, who was watching him with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion and something harder to name. Not quite trust yet, but the beginning of the willingness to extend it. "Maya, thank you for what you did tonight. I know you had every reason to walk away, and you didn't." "I wasn't going to leave a bleeding man tied up in a chair," Maya said simply. "Whatever else you are." "I meant what I said," Damian said. "I'll explain everything. Tonight, if you want it tonight." Maya studied him for a long moment. Sophie's small weight settled against her hip before she nodded once. "Tonight." It was nearly midnight by the time Marcus had them settled into the safe house on Willow Street, a modest, unremarkable brownstone 2 neighborhoods away, guarded discreetly enough that no one passing on the street would suspect it held anything worth guarding at all. Damian arrived an hour later, bandaged properly now by a Dr. Marcus trusted completely, moving slower than usual but upright, alert, already thinking 3 steps ahead of the men who had put him in that cellar. He found Maya sitting at the small kitchen table, Sophie finally asleep on the couch nearby, wrapped in a blanket Marcus's men had provided. "You look like you should be resting," Maya said, nodding toward the chair across from her. "I will," Damian said, lowering himself carefully into it. "After I tell you what you're actually caught in the middle of." He told her everything. Enzo Ricci's betrayal, Salvatore Reyes's decade-long campaign to find a weakness worth exploiting, Walter's role in delivering him straight into an ambush inside his own home. Maya listened without interrupting, her face carefully composed, though Damian saw the fear tighten behind her eyes when he explained plainly that both she and Sophie were now considered witnesses dangerous enough to silence. "I never wanted this for her," Maya said quietly, glancing toward her sleeping daughter. "I took this job because it paid better than anything else I could find, and because Sundays here meant I didn't have to pay for daycare I couldn't afford. I never imagined." "I know," Damian said, "and I take full responsibility for what my world has put you both in the middle of, which is why I need you to trust me with what happens next, the same way you trusted your instincts tonight when you decided to help me instead of walking away." Maya looked at him for a long moment, exhaustion and fear and something warmer, more complicated, moving behind her tired eyes. "What happens next?" she said. "If Salvatore Reyes decides we're worth silencing before you can stop him." Before Damian could answer, Marcus's voice came sharp and urgent from the front hallway, cutting through the quiet house like a blade. "Boss, we have a problem. A car's been circling the block for the last 10 minutes, and it just parked." Damian was on his feet before Marcus finished the sentence, ignoring the sharp pull of pain along his bandaged side. "How many?" he said. "2, that we can see." Marcus was already at the front window, weapon drawn, watching the street through a narrow gap in the curtains. "Could be more, we can't." Maya was up too, moving instinctively toward the couch where Sophie slept, gathering her daughter into her arms before the girl had even fully woken. The fierce, silent efficiency of a mother who had spent years learning to move fast when it mattered. "Back bedroom," Marcus said. "No windows facing the street." "Go now." Maya hesitated only a second, looking at Damian. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Damian said. "Go, Maya. Please." She went, Sophie's sleepy, frightened face pressed against her shoulder, disappearing down the narrow hallway just as the front door's lock gave way under a hard, deliberate shoulder strike. 2 men came through fast, and Damian recognized the second one instantly, even through the dim hallway light. Walter Higgins, no longer wearing the calm, composed mask of 22 years of quiet service, but something raw and desperate instead. A man who had run out of ways to undo what he'd already set in motion. "Walter," Damian said, his voice flat and cold in a way that made the older man flinch. "You brought them to my door." "I didn't have a choice," Walter said, and there was real anguish in it, buried under fear. "Salvatore said if I didn't help him find this house, He'd assume I'd turned on him too. Damian, please, I never wanted anyone hurt. I swear it. I only ever wanted. You wanted money you thought you deserved after 22 years of being taken for granted, Damian said. And instead you sold out the only family you had left. Marcus moved first, fast and controlled, disarming the man beside Walter before he'd fully raised his weapon. The brief struggle ending in seconds with the intruder face down on the floor, subdued. Walter stood frozen in the doorway, hands empty, shaking. I'm not going to hurt you, he said quickly. I came to stop this, Damian. Salvatore sent 2 more men behind us, 10 minutes out. I came ahead to warn you, not to finish what he started. Damian studied him for a long, cold moment, weighing 22 years of loyalty against 6 months of betrayal, weighing a man's genuine fear against the very real fact that a housekeeper and her 3-year-old daughter had nearly paid with their lives for his weakness. Prove it, Damian said. Right now. Tell me everything Salvatore has planned, and you might walk out of tonight instead of into a cell for the rest of your life. Walter talked. Fast, desperate, complete. The accounts Salvatore had opened, the timeline of the betrayal, the location of the warehouse where Salvatore Reyes was, at that very moment, waiting to hear whether tonight's job had finally been finished. 10 minutes later, when the second car of Salvatore's men arrived at the safe house, they found it empty except for Marcus's own reinforcements waiting for them. Damian, Maya, Sophie, and Walter already gone. Moved to a location even Walter no longer knew. Exactly as Damian had planned the moment the old butler's confession confirmed just how compromised that house had become. By dawn, acting on Walter's information and the kind of decisive, overwhelming response that had built Damian's reputation in the first place, Salvatore Reyes' warehouse operation was dismantled entirely. Salvatore himself was taken into custody by federal agents Damian's organization had quietly maintained a working relationship with for years. The kind of ending that left no bodies, no further war. Only a man finally out of leverage and out of allies, facing consequences he had spent a decade avoiding. Walter Higgins was not prosecuted. Damian, against Marcus's advice, chose instead to let him go quietly, stripped of his position, his pension revoked, but alive and unpursued. A mercy Damian gave not for Walter's sake, but because he understood, finally, that a man desperate enough to betray a family for money he felt he deserved was a tragedy, not a monster. And Damian had buried enough monsters already. 3 weeks later, on a bright, cold Sunday morning, Maya stood in the Ravenwood kitchen again, back at work, though everything about her circumstances had changed entirely. Sophie no longer waited quietly in the laundry room. She had a small desk of her own now, in the sunlit corner of Damian's study, where she colored quietly while the 2 adults worked through paperwork, phone calls, the slow rebuilding of an empire that had nearly cost Damian everything in a single night. You didn't have to do all this, Maya said one evening, watching Damian help Sophie into her coat by the front door. An act so far outside the man she'd first seen bleeding on a cellar floor that she still, sometimes, had to remind herself it was real. I didn't do it out of obligation, Damian said. I did it because your daughter untied my hands when she had every reason to run. And you chose to save a stranger's life instead of walking away from a war that wasn't yours. He looked at her, something steady and unhurried in his gaze that had not been there in their first 6 months of near silence. I've spent my whole life protecting people out of duty, Maya. I'd like to spend whatever comes next protecting the 2 of you because I choose to, not because I have to. Maya looked at him for a long moment, exhaustion and fear finally giving way to something warmer. Something she hadn't let herself feel in years. That sounds, she said quietly, like the beginning of something neither of us planned on. Some of the best things, Damian said, never are. Sophie, tugging impatiently at both their sleeves, looked up between them with the same fearless, unbothered directness that had first led her into a locked cellar 3 weeks earlier. Are we a family now? She asked. Neither adult answered right away. But neither of them let go of her hands either, and in the quiet, golden light of that Sunday morning, that was answer enough. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more emotional Mafia stories, and share it with someone who believes courage can come from the smallest hands and change everything. If you were Maya, would you have had the courage to save him, knowing it could put your own child in danger?